In 3, 2, 1.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session where we'll be talking about the Power Platform Unobtrusive DevOps pipeline. I am Rami, and we're going to get started soon. So I'll just start by sharing my screen, and I'll introduce myself in a second. So let's start with that. And swap those. All right. Nadia, do you want to project my slides?
Yep, you're all good to go.
Yes, good to go. Cool. So can you see my slides on the screen?
Yep, your slides are on the screen. You're all good.
Okay, cool. So today we're going to be talking about the Unobtrusive Power Platform DevOps pipeline. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Rami. I'm a solution architect currently working for DXC Eclipse in New Zealand, Wellington specifically. You can find me on all the different social networks such as LinkedIn and Twitter. So if you have any follow-up questions or you would like to discuss anything about the Power Platform, DevOps in particular, or Dynamics 365, I'm more than happy to help. Just a little bit about some of the work that I do. A couple of years ago, I've published a book called the Dynamics 365 Extensions Cookbook. It has a whole chapter dedicated to DevOps, although it might be a little bit dated now given some of the latest releases that they've done in the ALM space. I'm currently working on updating that book and putting the latest and the greatest there. So Pact has been harassing me to publish the latest version. So it's currently a work in progress. Some of the other work that I do in the communities that I run, the Dynamics or the Power Platform User Group in Wellington. I've been running that for probably about 10 years now. It has been sort of renamed from Dynamics to Power Platform just to sort of stay up to date. But I also run yearly events across New Zealand, so in Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch, around sort of the 365 Saturday or the Power Platform Saturday that we're going to call it this year. I'm also an MVP, so in the business application space. So just due to the contributions that I do and the enthusiasm and the evangelism that I do on the platform, I've been awarded the MVP status. I've been awarded 4 years so far. And among the other things that I do is also I'm TOGAF certified. Now, TOGAF doesn't really fit with what you see on the screen so far, but when I did my TOGAF certification, so TOGAF is the Open Group Architecture Framework certification. It's more around enterprise architecture rather than solution architecture. And within TOGAF, they talk about a maturity model. So what are the different steps in terms of where is your organization in terms of enterprise architecture, and what can you do to actually improve within that scale of maturity. And I thought that's actually quite an interesting topic and an interesting way to look at things. And I've applied that to a DevOps maturity model that I'll be demonstrating later in this session. So today's agenda, we'll do a DevOps overview just to understand, make sure everybody's on the same page on what do we mean by DevOps. We'll talk a little bit about the maturity model that I've mentioned as well. And then we'll have a look at the ALM best practices, especially the latest releases that Microsoft has published on how do they see ALM being implemented on the Power Platform. This is quite new material in this presentation, so I've done this talk quite a few times in the past. And one thing that I've noticed is that even if it's about 3 months or 6 months since I've done that session, every time I present that the topic, the majority of the content in the presentation is actually updated because it's such a moving pace, if you want, or practice. And most recently, the ALM best practices have been released, I think, in the last couple of months. So I'll be highlighting some of the latest the definitions that are in there. Within the whole DevOps sort of pipeline. I'll talk a little bit about how you can define quality control. How can you introduce testing and automated testing as well? What are sort of the different deployments models, the environment management that you can do? And then sort of towards the end, I'll talk about sort of the operations and the monitoring of your environment, as well as sort of what are the next steps that you can do. So without further ado, let's have a look at what is DevOps. So I find that this sort of screenshot in there is quite representative of what sort of DevOps really represents. And at the end of the day, it's about dev and it's about ops. So from the development side, how do we start by planning what we want to do, build it, code it, test it, and then release it. And this is sort of where it takes over into the operational side. How do we deploy it? How do we operate it? How do we monitor it? And once we've got that feedback loop, then we go back into planning new features, coding, building, and testing, releasing, and so on. So those are sort of at a high level, all the different disciplines, if you want, that may be introduced in DevOps. Now, obviously, each one of them can be a topic by itself. This talk is going to be more of a helicopter view of all the different capabilities that are available out there. Otherwise, I can probably spend an entire day or an entire week talking about DevOps in general. Right, so let's have a look at sort of what is the best way to introduce DevOps in your implementation. And from experience, I can say that the best way to deal with DevOps is to include it in your definition of done. So if you're implementing an agile process, an agile methodology, you've got user stories. A story is not done until the DevOps part is done. And that includes anything to do with quality control, anything to do with automation, anything to do with releases as well. Just make sure you do it as you do your work, as opposed to an afterthought. Otherwise, it will be too difficult to implement, and it will be done in a rush where you might not get the best out of DevOps. So with that in mind, let's talk about the maturity model. So where do you stand? And how can you actually get better in terms of DevOps capability? So as I mentioned earlier, when I did my TOGAF training, it had things, matrices like that would tell you what is, let's say in this one, the business transformation readiness assessment maturity model. What are the different levels? So not defined, ad hoc, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized, which are sort of the 6 scales that are available in there. And what does each one of those actually describe? So I thought, all right, well, I'm going to take the different disciplines in DevOps, add a maturity level at the top, and then put a definition into each one of them. And it would look something like that. So on the left-hand side, you've got the disciplines: deployment, version control, solution layering, quality control, test, source control, and environment control. On the top, I've got the scale. I've got 4 in this example: not defined, ad hoc, defined, and optimized. And within all of those, I'm going to add a definition for each one of them. And it goes something like that. So let's have a look at deployments, for example, which is the first row at the top. So if it's not defined, it means you're doing a manual deployment. You might be exporting solutions from one environment and then manually re-importing it into the next environment. If you're a little bit more mature than that, you might be using PowerShell scripts, which we will talk about later in our presentation. So you have a little script that would export your solution from your one environment, get it ready for the next environment, and push it into it. If you have something that is a little bit more defined, then you might be using a tool like Azure DevOps that would automatically do all of that based on a trigger, whether it's a manual or an automated one. And then the last one is the optimized, where basically whatever you've defined in terms of your DevOps drives the rest of the project. So you've got some really advanced custom builds that are implemented part of Azure DevOps that you use as a standard, and that drives how you do your work in your implementation or in your organization. Let's have a look at a different one, and let's look at testing, which is the 5th one down in the table. So the first one is that you do manual testing, conventional testing, functional testing. The second one, or the sort of ad hoc level one, is where you might have a little bit more maturity in terms of coding unit tests and making sure that whatever you're implementing does have its equivalent in terms of unit test, and you run those on an automatic sort of fashion, or it could be run on individuals on their machines. Level 2, which is defined, is where you actually introduce that part of your DevOps pipeline. So basically, as you're introducing a new piece of work, then that gets updated into your test suite, into your overall pipeline, and then you run those tests, and you may fail or pass the build based on the results of that. And the final one is the optimized, where you might be looking at setting a standard where you need a certain percentage of coverage within your code or within your configuration. So you drive basically the rest of your project, and you say, I will only accept if I can automate up to 60% or 70% of my testing to cover whatever we've implemented before I can accept the build and move forward. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different disciplines, but those are sort of at a high level some of the ideas that you might get. Source control is actually becoming quite an interesting one, especially with the latest definitions that were introduced with the ALM sort of Microsoft best practices. Where do you stand or where do you want to stand depends on the project that you're on and your appetite to invest in DevOps. If you have a really small project, I think going optimized is going to be an overkill and probably not a well-defined investment in that space. If you've got a small project, a one-man band, you're just basically doing some simple configuration, then the best way of doing it is to actually leave it at level 0 and keep things manual, maybe level 1 if you want to be a bit more optimized. If you have a big project, definitely going at the defined stage or at the optimized stage is the best way forward. Industry standard usually sits at level 2. And this is based on experience from what I've seen on previous projects and previous customers, is that this is where they tend to be. Going beyond that will require a significant amount of investment, which may or may not be justified. Cool. So in the past, when I wrote my chapter on DevOps in the book, I had a pipeline that looks similar to what we've got on the screen in here. So you've got a Dynamics 365 source and you've got a destination. You will have a little bit of automation that happens on the source itself, and then you will deploy that into another environment by using either a CI/CD platform such as Octopus Deploy. Back then, that was the flavor of the month, and use a source control repository such as Git. So going through the different bits, so as you build your solution, you would have some unit tests that are run onto that. And then as you're comfortable and happy with what you've implemented, then you would export that and add them as artifacts into your Git repository. You might be doing a deployment, an automatic deployment that would extract from one environment and then push it into the other environment. And you might completely recreate a destination environment by having an environment sort of management type of things. Now, this is just sort of an example on how it might work. At the end, you might do a little bit of regression testing into your destination. Now, the order of what is in here has changed over time, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Now, why do I have Octopus Deploy in there, and why did I not change it over time? Why do I keep referring to Octopus Deploy? The main reason is because at the end of the day, what is happening behind the scenes is that you're implementing a collection of scripts that will help you with most of that automation, whether you're extracting your information, whether you're running your unit test, or whether you're building environments, setting up new environments, or deploying into an environment. All of that, at the end of the day, is driven by some sort of scripting. PowerShell is the most common one. And Octopus Deploy, for example, has a range of sort of native out-of-the-box capabilities. Some of it is to run .NET code, run Java code, or do the deployments as well, but also run scripting languages as well, such as PowerShell and Bash and so on, but PowerShell being the main one. And basically, regardless of which tool you are using, as long as it can deal with .NET code, as long as it can deal with JavaScript, as long as it can deal with PowerShell, then you've got yourself sorted. Now, what is the best tool to use? In my opinion, that would be Azure DevOps, mainly because it has out-of-the-box connectors that will simplify all of that scripting and turn it into a point-and-click configuration where creating an Azure DevOps for the Power Platform would take no more than 15 minutes, just setting up, clicking a few things, defining where your environment is, defining how your pipeline triggers, and you're done. And again, going back to my original point, the recommendation is always to do that with your project as it progresses, as opposed to an afterthought. If you do it upfront, then it's much easier to maintain it. It's much easier to build on top of it and have quite a robust DevOps pipeline. Cool. So the next slide is actually taken from the Power Platform ALM recommendation from Microsoft. And as you can see in here, the way they actually do it is that they've got a development environment where they can pull and push information from, and then they use source control to actually store all of those artifacts, making source control your source of truth. And this is very important to note, because in the past, the way we've done it is that we would have a dev environment that is the source of truth. All the work that we do will be sort of configured in there, and then we treat that as a golden environment, so we never reset it, we never delete it, we never do anything to it, because it's such a valuable, it is our source of truth. If we lose that, we lose everything. Whereas the Microsoft recommendation is to move away from that sort of design pattern, if you want, and then focus more on source control rather than your environment. And in source control, you should be able to recreate the dev environment based on all the artifacts that you've got stored in source control. And I have seen that done, and it is doable, and it's not that difficult. I'll talk a little bit about how we can actually get to that point. Once you've got that, then you can target an environment, a test environment, or even recreating a dev environment, a production environment, whatever it is, and then you can push all of your configuration, your data, your customization into that environment using a DevOps pipeline. A little bit more on that moving forward, but basically your environment, you might not just have one dev environment, you might have a collection of those, and I'll tell you why in a second. Right, so all of the different disciplines that we're going to talk about. So we've got sort of quality control and static analysis, which is really important. And I want to draw a parallel between what we've been doing as professionals, as custom coding professionals over the years, over the decades, and what we're currently doing with the Power Platform. Typically, when I'm sort of in the process of recruiting people in my organization, there's one question that I always ask them is, what are the top 5 quality elements that you want to see in your in someone's code, and how do you deal with it? Like, how can you review code and then tell someone whether this is good code or bad code? What are the key indicators, basically? And a lot of the time I get answers around, we make sure that we have comments, we make sure that, the classes are not too large, we make sure that we follow a specific naming convention and so on. And I said, this is all good, but you basically have a bunch of tools that can do that for you. So Visual Studio has built-in rules that you can implement that would define what is acceptable and what is not, and whether that is returned as an error or as a warning. Ghost Doc, for example, can look at your code and tell you what is in the whether you're following standard documentation. ReSharper is a very common tool that is used for quality control. PowerSoft can do automated security testing as well. So there's all those tools that are available almost for free, because you may buy a license for them, but you can run them as many times as you want, and you will get the sort of results on what is quality. Whereas what we typically look at in code is beyond that. It's more around, are you using the right design patterns? Do you have sort of code that looks a little bit dodgy that maybe a tool cannot pick up, but someone with experience will be able to tell you what it is? Now, this is all good. We've got years of experience in terms of custom coding, but how about what's currently happening with the Power Platform in terms of configuration and point and click work? The maturity is not at the same level as custom code. You don't have as many tools that can tell you what's wrong with your configuration just by running some static analysis. They have been introducing a few, and then we'll talk a little bit about those. So when it comes to testing, especially when you're building sort of your extensions for the Power Platform, you might be building some JavaScript, or you might be building some plugins, or maybe some Azure functions that integrate with Dynamics or with the Power Platform. What I typically tend to say is that rather than having something that is quite monolithic, sort of like a big JavaScript layer, then try to layer it. You know, at the end of the day, your JavaScript will be using an execution context, and what would be best is to actually have a separate business logic as well as separate data access layer, giving you this sort of layers of customization that you're doing, and then you can take whatever you don't want and mock it. You can do that with JavaScript. You do have unit testing frameworks and mocking frameworks that are available for JavaScript that can run in headless browsers, so that you can run your tests on your business logic, make sure that everything is working fine. Same thing happens with plugins, where you have your plugin or your function, you've got an organization service at the core of it that does all the interaction with the platform. And then what I suggest to do is to actually layer it, have a business logic, have a data access layer. And then what you can do is mock one of those and say, all right, today I'm just going to unit test the business logic, and I don't want any of the other layers to be tested. And then you mock those using the conventional sort of .NET mocking ways. Or you can use a fake organization context. And there's a couple of them that have been implemented over time by the community. The main two are Jordi Montaña's Fake XRM Easy, which is a really fantastic framework to use, and Daryl Labar's XRM unit testing. I know both of them, Jordi and Daryl, they're both MVPs, or at least Daryl is currently an MVP. And they're really brilliant minds, really great guys. And it was really interesting to see how those two frameworks came together. So they were implemented separately, and they do have some slight nuances. I cannot tell which one is actually best. It's whatever your personal preference, mainly because I don't want to sort of choose Jordi's one over Daryl's one. I've used both in previous projects, so you know, either one of them is fit for purpose. But the idea is that it will allow you to basically build an organization context in memory just for your unit test, which becomes really useful when you're sort of testing all your implementations. So you start your unit test, think of it as a Power Platform database gets created in memory. You go and interact with it, you store information in it, you retrieve information from it, and then at the end of the day, once you're done, then you tear down everything, and that database disappears. Really useful frameworks to have a look at. When it comes to sort of overall, so this is for unit testing, especially when you're doing mocking and using fake frameworks. But then when it comes to regression testing, you can do that either through an end-to-end regression by using code, so basically creating a record in Dynamics and then retrieving the result and checking whether your code has run correctly, or you can use a UI test, more of a regression test, using a framework such as EasyRepro. So what I've got in the next slide, hopefully it will launch. So in here is just showing you how it currently works. And as you can see, there's probably about a dozen lines of code in terms of what your actual sort of method or test is going to do, but it takes care of logging into your environment. It goes into sort of knows how to log in, if you've got pop-ups, what to do. This is probably a slightly older one that is using the classic interface rather than unified interface. As you can see, it's moved to accounts. It actually selected a different view. It clicked on the new create new record, and then it comes up with the dialog. It fills in the information that you need, and it clicks on the save and close button, and then you would get a green tick that your test has passed. The EasyRepro framework is actually quite comprehensive and is really sort of a good framework to use. It's built on top of Selenium, and what it allows you to do is to basically introduce all your UI testing, your regression testing, to make sure that it's working as expected. It's in constant development, so I've been contributing to it as well. you will see that some of the latest releases that they've announced, such as like the model dialogues that are now relatively new, they've been announced in April, do have support in this framework, and it is implemented by people at Microsoft, so it's not something that will lose support anytime soon. So I do recommend that you have a look at it and you look into implementing it in your solution for regression testing. Cool. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the layering of your solutions as we're going to different stages. So solution management and layering is important. So earlier I was talking about having multiple environments. Now the recommendation from Microsoft is always to go with managed solutions. So whenever you go beyond the dev environment, you need to have your solutions deployed as managed. Don't be afraid of using managed. They have improved significantly. They do maybe have a bad reputation because in the past, it was known to have a little bit of issues or to get you in a deadlock where you're basically stuck and you have to basically rebuild your environment from scratch. Most of those issues have been, if not all actually, of those issues have been addressed and are now sort of the recommendation is to use managed solutions. Now, one thing to note is that as you've got multiple solutions that are dependent on each other, make sure that you've got the right layering. So if you have a solution A, for example, as a start, and then you've got a solution B that you need to build on top of that, just make sure that they are, even if there's a dependency, that's perfectly fine, but they are separate in terms of deployments. Recommendation from Microsoft is as you're building those into your dev environment to have one environment for each of your eventually going to turn into a managed solution. So let's say you've got solution A, which is eventually going to become managed, then you need an environment for that. You've got solution B that is eventually going to be on top of solution A, then you need another dev environment specifically for that. So what you would have in terms of sort of setup is a dev environment that would have solution A unmanaged. This is where you do the development for your unmanaged solution. And then you would have another dev environment that would have solution A managed, deploy on it, and solution B unmanaged on top of that, where you would develop your solution B, and so on. And then eventually, once you go to the test environment, then all of those are exported as managed in the right order and imported into the test environment and so on. And a quick sort of mention about your environment. Make sure that, so the solution lifecycle before we get to the environments, understand the lifecycle of the solution. So when you create a new solution, what state it's in, how can you update it, how can you patch it, how can you upgrade it, and basically you would have your patch 1 that you do over your managed solution, a patch 2, and then finally you upgrade it so that you can move to the next environment. Understand the life cycle of your solutions, understand how managed solutions work, and that will minimize the amount of sort of headache that you would have down the track. Cool. Moving on, automated deployments. Let's talk a little bit about that. In the next slide, you're going to see sort of a collection of environments that sort of I mentioned in the past. So if you've got several solutions that are built on top of each other, make sure you have several dev environments. Come up with an environment strategy. So what is your dev environment? How many environments do you have? How many dev? How many test environments? How many UAT or production? So define the strategy up front so that everybody's on the same page. And there are some do's and don'ts in that space. So for example, the default solution, you will notice that when you create a new Power Platform tenancy, you will always have a default solution. Don't use your default solution for any production data. This is the recommendation from Microsoft. The default one is basically a sandpit, a playground, where individuals can go there, maybe try flow, maybe try some automation, or maybe create even a Canvas app in it if they want to, but don't use that for production. For production, create your own environment and then use that part of your ALM strategy. How many environments you should have, that depends on the project. Typically, we would have 4 dev, test, test would sort of dub as system integration test, and then we would have UAT or pre-prod and production. But again, I've seen sort of projects where we had 8 environments that we're playing with. You might have more in the dev environment if you have multiple managed and unmanaged solutions that you need to look after. So it all depends on the scale of your project. Definitely don't go with one production instance only. The main thing is that instances are free. So, go nuts, create as many as you want, and then leverage them to a healthy ALM sort of environment. Cool. Now that we've got our environment strategy sorted, then how are we going to push our configuration from one environment to the other? So typically what you'd have is an event happening in the sort of configuration side. It could be a manual one or it could be an automated one. And then once this is detected, then you've got some automation that will detect that there's a change and then go and call Azure DevOps to actually go and do your deployment. How do you detect a change automatically? Well, you can either monitor it. So every time a version is changed, for example, on your solution, then trigger automation or, poll it once in a while and have a look whether there are any changes. And if you detect something, then pick up those changes and then pass them on to Azure DevOps. Or you can use something like a free solution that you can get from AppSource called the change tracking solution. This is provided by Microsoft Labs. And what it does is that every time you create or you publish a solution within your Dynamics instance, it actually goes and creates a record in Dynamics 365 to tell you that there has been a change. Now that can be your trigger for flow that would detect that there is a change and then go and call Azure DevOps. So all of it will be sort of run within your platform. Another way of having a look at it is to have, as I said, like a recurring process, flow or logic apps, for example, and that can work in some other environments. So what I have in here, and this is something that we've implemented a couple of years ago, is once a day, go and have a look on whether the version of your instance has changed or not. So Microsoft typically would do updates on their platform every fortnight or sometimes every week, sometimes every month, and then go and look at that minor version. If that version has changed, then go and trigger some other automation, such as run your regression test to make sure that everything is working. So this is not in terms of configuration or customization that you're doing in there, but this is in terms of capturing whether Microsoft is doing any updates on the platform and for you to detect whether there's anything that changed or anything that failed or not. Cool. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that once you go into this automation, a lot of it is going to be driven by PowerShell. So what we've got in here is a list of PowerShell libraries, if you want, that will enable the DevOps automation. So we've got Microsoft.xrm.data.PowerShell that is quite commonly used to manipulate your environment. We've got the package deployment PowerShell. So if you're familiar with package deployment, it's historically it's been sort of released with the SDK. You can now sort of download it separately, but it has an application that actually takes a collection of solutions, some code to execute before and after the deployment, as well as a collection of data that can be packaged and deployed with your environment or with your deployment. So in the past, we've used to run the application either through command line or through the application itself and do the deployment, whereas now you've got PowerShell scripts that can do it for you. That becomes quite powerful in terms of deploying from one environment to the other. And the last one that was introduced was the Online Management API, probably also a couple of years ago. So the Online Management API allows you to control your instances. You can basically create an instance from scratch. So you can start a new instance, giving it a convention name, and then you can go and either restore it from a golden copy, so get the data from another instance and then restore it, or you can build it from scratch. But what it allows you to do is basically create, delete, restore, backup, manage your instances of Dynamics 365. And this is perfect. If you're doing a nightly build, for example, and you want to make sure that your source of truth that is in Git, for example, or an Azure DevOps repository is working properly, then overnight, you would spin up a new instance using the Online Management API. You would go and push all the configuration using the data the Microsoft.xrm.data PowerShell scripts to push the configuration and build them and put all your managed solutions on top of each other, and then run your regression testing, such as Easy Repro, or whether it's code-based unit testing, and then make sure everything is running healthily. And then finally, sort of if you don't want to use PowerShell, there are alternatives in terms of REST APIs that will allow you to do all of the above. There's a link for the online management API, and there's obviously the REST API that comes out of the box with Dynamics for more record management. So let's do a quick demo. So what I'm going to have in here is I'll just open PowerShell. I've got a few commands that I've sort of saved in there, but let's have a look at sort of if you want to have a look at what is available in there. So let's say if you do get CRM. All right, looks like I did get slightly disconnected. Can you hear me, Nadia?
Yep, you're all back.
Cool, awesome. All right, so you can, delete records if you want to, but also, if you look through them, especially if we go, so for example, let's do instance. Then in here, you can, especially for the XRM online management API, you can get your instances, have a look at what's in there. You can do backups. You can get the backups, one backup or many backups. You can reset your CRM instance. You can remove a CRM instance. You have full management of your Dynamics instances as well. So let's have a look. There was another command that I had saved in there, sorry, CRM instance. The one is Power Checker. We'll have a look at later. But within your CRM ones, let's have a look if I can actually find the one. You can publish. Here we go. So you can do a publish CRM customization, publish or customizations, which will give you a little bit more granularity over basically importing solutions, publishing your customization. Here we go, import CRM solution, async, translations, and so on. So you've got a huge range. Trying to log in again.
Yeah, you seem to be back in, Rami.
Hello.
Hi, Rami. You're back on. Perfect.
I'm back on. Yeah, it looks like there's a bit of connectivity issues in there. All right, so this is sort of at a high level, all the different bits that I wanted to cover about PowerShell. So let's carry on. And right, so the next bit is that, so far I've been sort of mixing the discussion about Dynamics 365 and PowerApps. In the past, a lot of our work was purely focused on Dynamics 365. I'm talking about customer engagement, CE or CRM. But then over time, the Power Platform came in, and then Dynamics 365 was not the flavor of the month. And again, this is a new paradigm shift where the focus is more on configuration rather than customization. Canvas apps, Flow configuration, Power BI, and so on. So again, those years of experience are still valid that we had in terms of customization, but then it's a new era. And how are we going to ensure that we've got all the standards and the guidelines and the best practices that should be followed moving forward? Well, there's a few sort of white papers that have been published by Microsoft. There's a Canvas app coding standard and guidelines that are available there that you can download and have a look at. But then, how can we make sure that, for example, the flow that we've built is following best practice, or the solution that we've put together is also following best practice? Well, the good news is that we've got something like Flow Checker, that you can either run manually from the user interface, or you can run through the commands, the PowerShell commands, and you've also got the solution checker. Now, the solution checker is actually really important to note in this space. It actually does a comprehensive check on everything that you've got within your solution and gives you feedback on what's happening. So it covers plugins, customization, JavaScript, your forms, your solution themselves, dependencies, and so on. And it gives you quite a good report that comes out of it. So I do recommend that before you actually deploy your solution, to run the solution checker, or even better, as I'm going to demonstrate later, to actually introduce that as a step in your DevOps pipeline to run the solution checker. Just like in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about static analysis. Static analysis can be introduced within your DevOps pipeline if you're doing pure .NET bespoke development, and you can fail or pass a build based on your preference on what you reckon is important. So for example, you can say, if it comes up with a compilation error, fail my build. That's the minimum. Or you can say, if it comes up with any warnings, then fail my build. If it comes up with information, fail my build, which might be a little bit, too strict. But typically, warnings or errors at least is where we would fail a build. And what you can do in this instance, when you're doing PowerApps, is run the solution checker, and depending on what it's returning, decide on whether you're going to fail your build or not. So basically you just select the solution that you want, you click on run, and it shows you what, it runs in the background, actually shows you some of the results that are available in there. And this is an example of what it might look like. As you can see, it's quite comprehensive. So it goes through everything, and it gives you a sort of a statement and a description of what your errors might be. And it can give you spit up a nice report as well in an Excel format. So let's have a look at that. And what I might do is most likely I'm going to open a DevOps pipeline. All right, so this is Azure DevOps. I have installed the PowerApps build tools that I'll also talk a little bit later in the presentation. And I'll show you how you can create a new pipeline. So let's create a new pipeline in here. Hopefully it's not going to cause too much load on the presentation. So I go into the classic editor. I trigger from my Azure repository that is using Git. And I'm going to say start with an empty job. And within that, I'm going to add, so this is the agent that is going to run whatever configuration that I want, or my pipeline. And in there, I filtered based on Power or PowerApps, and it shows you all the different capabilities that you can have in here. And then one of them is going to be the solution checker, so PowerApps checker. Adding that, it requires a little bit of information. Now, what's really interesting is that it can take a rule set. And I think out of the box right now, I think they're not going to load because I'm not connected to the environment, but you will get two rule sets. The first one is the standard one that you run from the user interface whenever you have a solution. The second one is what Microsoft uses to decide whether you've got any errors or warnings before your solution is accepted in App Source. So Microsoft has sort of open sourced that set of rules and then included it in the solution checker. In fact, if I go PowerApps, I think, and actually I might have it in here. Here we go. So this is invoke PowerApps checker. So you can run it from PowerApps as well. So I'm going to do a get help on that command in PowerShell and then get the details for that help. And as you can see, there's heaps of stuff that can happen in there. But one of the parameters that you can enter is the set of rules that you want to execute. This is really important because as this becomes sort of more mature and more rule sets are available to be shared across and to be used, and then you can decide what rule set is fit for purpose for your presentation, for your project. Again, as I said, it all depends on the size of your project. If it's a small project, then you might relax the rules a little bit. If it's a big project and you know that there is like concurrent developers working on it, and you might get people that sort of overlap in terms of work, then maybe you need some rules that are a little bit stricter. Some customers might have sort of more on, they are more concerned about security. For example, you might introduce rule sets that are associated with security rules and so on. So basically giving you the flexibility of actually managing those rules and deciding what to do is really important. And again, that comes with the maturity of the platform itself. And then in terms of in the advanced space, you can decide, all right, well, depends on what sort of error I get, whether it's a critical error, high, medium, low, or just informational, I can decide. Just in time to drink a bit of water. All right, so based on the error level that you want to define in here and the number of errors that you get, you can decide whether this is going to fail your pipeline or not. So again, you're sort of introducing the flexibility of defining what is acceptable and what is not by doing static analysis on your solution before you even do your deployment, or even on an ongoing basis. Every time you make a change, you publish or you trigger and you say, all right, my changes are now ready to go into source control, then you can run some static analysis into it. Cool. So let's carry on. Cool. So this is sort of the PowerShell capabilities that I talked about, specific for PowerApps, and part of the administration or the checker is we can go and check what's happening in that space. Right. Azure DevOps. So difference between VSTS and Azure DevOps. VSTS is the old sort of Visual Studio Team Services that we talked to, that were quite popular a couple of years ago. They're a bit monolithic, so you get either everything or not. Azure DevOps is a little bit more flexible in terms of selecting the bits that you want. So I want the Azure boards for work management. I want a pipeline to actually do my deployments. I want the repository for source control. I want to use Azure test plans, or you can mix and match and use Jira as well as Azure DevOps. It's up to you. You can do whatever you want with lots of connectors in between those two. But as I mentioned, what's really important is that once you've got your Azure DevOps, you download the PowerApps build tools for Azure DevOps. They are available. It's actually becoming quite popular. There's another open source one that is also available in Azure DevOps that is published by one of the MVPs. Quite a good one, actually. It has slightly more features than the official Microsoft one, and that's on purpose. So Microsoft doesn't want to include things that they might think is not best practice. But either way, both of them are very similar and both of them are very capable. But basically what they'll give you is a layer on top of all those PowerShell scripts that you've got to do your automation, and turn that into point and click. Just like we saw with the solution checker, where you've got an action that you define and you say, all right, well, this is my solution. And if you return any errors, then do this or that to fail your builds. So this has a bunch of things included in it. So helper task, quality task, solution task, and environment task. And that's basically everything that we talked about in this presentation. Manipulating environments, building them from scratch, deleting them, recreating them, backing them up. Solution task, where you do deployments of your solutions, publishing, quality task, which will include solution checker. The helper task is basically the prerequisite that you need so that it deploys everything that is required for the agent to be up to speed to be able to do the rest of the pipeline. So in here, basically, I'm just going through the different capabilities of each one of them. I'm just going to skip through that, just conscious of time. So having a look at the demo, so going back to my Azure DevOps. So I'm going to maybe delete that one. Remove selected task. I'm going to create a new task in here, and I'm going to select Power. And I'm going to put the installer task. I'll just keep it really simple, just to show you what's going to happen once I've got that one. So if I click on Queue and I click on Run, all right, so it's going to start running in here. So this is, I'm manually triggering an Azure DevOps pipeline, and all it has is the prerequisite, which is basically getting the helper tasks. And what you will notice in here is that the first thing is that we'll do the tool installer, and as it runs, which is right now, is going to start by installing your PowerShell script. So the library, which is the XRM Online Management API that we talked about. And as you wait and see, the rest of the library is going to install the data one. It's also going to install the package deployer. So basically, again, repeating what I was saying, is that at the core of it, it's PowerShell. And by using Azure DevOps, it will give you those out-of-the-box tools that will allow you to easily configure your Azure DevOps, your pipeline, by using point and click. So this is just the beginning of what it's going to do. And then obviously you can add many more steps, such as exporting the solution, putting it into your source control so that it becomes the source of truth, and then rebuilding your new environments based on the rest of the bits that you've got. Right, so possibilities. What can you do? What else can you do? So one thing is always about, or once we've done our checks, we've done our unit tests, we're happy with the quality of what we've got, we've done our deployments, now we need to monitor. How are we going to do this monitoring? Well, one way of doing it, and that's sort of defined by Microsoft, is to actually build some PowerApps to monitor your PowerApps, or maybe build some flows to monitor your flows, or build some flows to monitor your PowerApps. Because the last thing that you want is for your sort of environments and for your instances to go out of control. Microsoft is all about empowering users to actually be able to do whatever they can to be more productive. But then from an enterprise perspective, you might be concerned that things might go out of control. So one thing that we typically refer to is that we don't want to have basically access on steroids in the cloud, or Lotus Notes. If you've been around for a while, you know about Lotus Notes, how anybody can create an app, and that went viral, and then people started creating enterprise scale applications on Lotus Notes that were not monitored, and they were not sort of treated as enterprise assets. So basically, by using PowerApps or by using Flow, you can monitor what's happening around and understand. On top of that, Microsoft has a lot of telemetry that will show you what's happening in that space, how many new instances are being created, whether there are new flows, new Canvas apps, and it will tell you whether they're being shared. So if someone is playing around with Canvas app and creating an application for them, then maybe that's good. But then if they start sharing it and you notice that there's 100 person in your organization using it, then you need to be alerted about it and you need to manage it, take control over it. And simply because it becomes such a valuable asset that it needs to follow the enterprise standards on how it's implemented and how it's monitored. So basically, they give you the option to either do that using the telemetry that they provide, or by building your own automation through Canvas apps or flows to actually monitor what's happening in that space. A lot of this information is available in the Center of Excellence kit that is available for download. And then you can have a look at it. That's the starting point. They give you a lot of information about administration and governance, which is basically the core of making sure that you're monitoring everything correctly and you've got everything under control. So just recapping what we talked about in this DevOps session, there's literally tons to talk about, and that's why I was rushing through some of the topics. But if you think about it, we talked about how can we do our quality control up front when we're doing our development, whether it's unit testing or regression testing, UI testing. How can we do a static analysis on the solutions that are being deployed by using the solution checker? How we can actually do this deployment in a brand new environment, and how do we manage our code to make sure that we've got one source of truth. And then once all of that gets together and it's deployed, then how can we monitor it and make sure it's all working as expected. So again, lots of topics. Probably we can spend an hour on each one of those, but hopefully that give you a big sort of overview of the different capabilities of the Power Platform, DevOps options that are available out there, and hopefully you'll be able to use some of those in your organization. with that, thank you very much for attending. Nadia, I'll hand over to you.
Awesome, thank you for that, Rami. So I'm just going to go through some upcoming Reactor events while Rami takes a quick look at your Q&A. So let me just share my screen for everyone. Perfect. Okay, so just a quick one here. If you're not familiar with the Microsoft Reactor or some of the content that we're sharing, you'll be able to find out more information on meetup.com/Microsoft Reactor Sydney. You can also follow us on our Twitter page as well. We share a lot of global content. We do run workshops and trainings as well. I just thought I'll go through a couple that are coming up this week and next week. So tomorrow we have a session on how Azure SQL can be your preferred database platform. Now this session is actually going to be run by the Azure SQL product team. So we'll be joined by one of their principal program managers in Redmond and their senior program manager here in Sydney. So in this session, they're going to walk you through the various options to deploy Azure SQL based on your workload and dive into some features that make it an effective platform. Next week, we then have a session on Microsoft 365 adoption success. Now, this is going to be led by Kirsty McGrath, who is an MVP. So Kirsty is going to take you through some challenges and success stories around M365 adoption. As you know, she's someone who's been there and done that. You know, Kirsty is looking forward to making sure that you're on the right track. We do have another session next week as well called MLOps using Azure Machine Learning. So this session is going to be run by Anath, who is a lead architect for data, AI, and IoT at Microsoft. So this is going to be a very demo-heavy session to introduce the new features with Azure ML services capabilities and how this can assist to bring the practice of data science into the age of modern DevOps. So these are the couple of the events that are coming up. If you do have any feedback on the events that we've been running on Rami's session today, please feel free to leave some feedback for our survey and I'll pop it in the chat using the event code 7653. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it back over to Rami to answer some of your questions. Thanks, Rami.
Cool. Thanks, Nadia. I think most of the questions are around whether the slides are going to be available. So yeah, I'm sure not a problem. I'll hand them over to you, Nadia, and then you can publish them. Maybe that's the easiest way.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, and there was another question around what is the most challenging thing by using Azure DevOps and the Power Platform? So getting your solutions right is really important, especially when you're working with managed solutions. This is the number one. The second thing is that in the past, I used to say that every Dynamics developer is a .NET developer. Now I say that every Dynamics or Power Platform developer is also an Azure developer. So when you talk about enterprise solutions, you're not just talking about a dynamic solution that you're sort of moving from one environment to the other, but about an ecosystem that you're working with. So you've got some Azure functions, maybe some Azure Service Bus, some key vaults that you're using. So there's a collection of additional things that you also need to introduce within your Azure DevOps. And that introduces a little bit of complexity. And I'll give you an example. You are moving a solution from your dev environment to your test environment. That solution includes a plugin that will actually write a message to an Azure Service Bus, ASB. And typically that solution will have the link to the ASB coded in it, sort of embedded within your solution. So when you move it to the test environment, that endpoint is not relevant anymore, is not correct. So solutions currently don't allow you that flexibility to actually be environment aware. And as you move the solution from one environment to the other, to know exactly which endpoint to use. So when you face a situation like that, you need to introduce another step, which typically is done using PowerShell, to go and say, all right, once the solution is deployed, then I need to run that little script that will go and point to the right environments. So those little things that you need to know about, and with experience, you'll be able to sort of master those, but to understand how it works and what needs to be done. The other thing that I've been looking at quite a lot, and that's probably coming in the next iteration of that sort of DevOps session that I'm doing for the community summit that is later in October, I think. This is going to include infrastructure as code. So I am deploying a Azure function, and it uses a little bit of infrastructure for that. I've got the ASB, I've got my key vault, and so on. How do I actually have all of that in my Azure DevOps pipeline so that I can build an entire environment from scratch? Think of it as a, in Azure, we've got the resource groups. I can basically spin up a new resource group, build my entire infrastructure in there using code and using DevOps, and then install Dynamics and then get everything to talk to each other. So this is another layer of challenges that might come in as well. And I think whether there are any new ones, no, I think that's it. Right, and there was a session about a question about the upcoming sessions and sort of on PowerApps, which you've covered, Nadia. So I think that's us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Rami, and thank you to everyone for joining today. As mentioned, we do have these events every week, so feel free to tune in and leave your feedback. So thank you for that. Thank you, Rami, and we will catch you next time. Bye.
Thank you.